in the early, dark hours of January 18th, 1887, with the thermometer plummeting to 44 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit and the gale wailing like a tortured spirit across the Wyoming plains, a trio of families trudged single file through knee-deep snowdrifts. Their lips had turned a pale shade of blue. Inside their damp blankets, their fingers felt stiff as boards. Ahead of them, glowing like a beacon amidst the blizzard, a slender pillar of smoke drifted up from a peculiar cabin. A dwelling that boasted 2 stories, while every other home in the area barely had one. William McAllister, the wealthiest cattleman in Laramie County, was carrying his wife in his arms because her legs could no longer bear her weight. Charles Dietrich, the German carpenter responsible for erecting half the homesteads in the valley, dragged his 3 young boys along, having tethered them together with a rope so they wouldn't vanish into the blinding whiteout. And Martha Cunningham, the devout matriarch who constantly quoted scripture during Sabbath gatherings, wept quietly since the weight of her own pride hurt far worse than the freezing temperatures currently draining her life away. All 3 of them had branded Mateo Sandoval a lunatic. The whole trio had mocked him relentlessly for a year and a half. And yet, as their own residences slowly morphed into frigid tombs, they were marching right toward the doorstep of the very man they had scorned. However, to comprehend how things reached this point, we have to rewind to the very beginning. We must go back to the springtime of 1885, back when a 43-year-old widower rolled into the valley, bringing only a pair of scrawny cows, a battered wagon, and a thoroughly shattered heart. Mateo Sandoval wasn't cut from the same cloth as the rest of the settlers flocking to Wyoming, with visions of gold strikes or boundless acreage. Mateo was on the run from grief. He had buried his wife, Rosa, following childbirth complications with their 4th baby down in Taos, New Mexico. The infant didn't make it either. Within half a year's time, Mateo laid to rest both the woman he had cherished for 2 decades and the son he never got the chance to know. His 3 surviving daughters, 14-year-old Eleanor, 11-year-old Carmela, and little 7-year-old Lucia, would stare at him with hollow expressions, waiting for their father to determine whether the household would press onward or simply surrender to the sorrow. Mateo chose to keep moving forward. He liquidated everything they owned back in New Mexico, scraped together $87.30, and purchased a plot of land out in the Laramie River Valley. The dirt went cheap simply because it sat miles away from town, far from the railroad tracks, and completely isolated from just about everything. Still, it boasted clear running water and plenty of thick grass. For a fellow who had been stripped of everything except his girls, it proved to be enough. Upon pulling into the basin in April of 1885, the local residents greeted him with a blend of morbid curiosity and outright pity. A widowed Mexican fellow hauling 3 young girls into a harsh territory where the winters routinely slaughtered tough, able-bodied men. William McAllister, the proud owner of 200 head of cattle and a 2-story home featuring actual glass window panes, advised him in a deeply patronizing tone, "Sandoval, this ain't no place for your kind. The winter season out here takes no prisoners. If you lack the funds to build a proper shelter, you'd best head back south before the snow starts flying." Charles Dietrich, the German builder who demanded $2 for a day's labor, volunteered to construct a standard-issue cabin for him at a flat rate of $60. Pine beams, a plank roof, and a solid stone hearth. That is what everybody has. That is exactly what works, he explained, projecting the absolute authority of a master craftsman. Yet $60 represented practically every last cent Mateo possessed. Were he to blow all that cash on the dwelling, he wouldn't have a single dime left over for planting seeds, acquiring tools, or stocking up on winter provisions. Martha Cunningham, the lady who hosted the Sunday church services in her parlor, paid Mateo a visit bearing a basket of baked bread and a deeply condescending smile. "That poor soul," she gossiped to the other housewives later on. "He came out here without a bride, lacking any funds, and with zero grasp of what lies ahead of him. I handed him a good book and advised him to pray. That is honestly the only thing he can do. Mateo Sandoval, however, hadn't traveled all the way up to Wyoming to solicit folks' pity. He had journeyed there to survive. Furthermore, he harbored a secret that not a single one of his neighbors knew about. A specific memory passed down by his grandfather, Esteban Sandoval, who had been raised high up in the mountains of Chihuahua throughout the most brutal winters of the 18th century. His granddad used to share tales explaining exactly how the high-altitude shepherds outlasted the lethal freezes despite having scarcely any firewood to burn. The old man had taught him one very basic law that nature never fails to respect. Heat rises. One evening in May, while sitting around the campfire alongside his 3 girls, Mateo sketched out his blueprint in the dirt using a twig. "We are going to build things differently," he informed them. "We'll set up the living quarters on the bottom and place the barn right up top. The cattle will reside directly overhead. Their body heat will radiate down through our ceiling and keep us toasty all winter long." Elena, being the eldest, scrunched her brow in confusion. "Papa, the local folks already look at us funny. If you put up something like that, they'll assume you've lost your mind." Mateo offered a sorrowful little smile. "Sweetheart, the day your mama passed away, I figured out that other people's opinions won't ever save your life. But wisdom certainly will. Your great-grandfather Esteban made it through 40 bitter seasons relying on this exact method, and we are going to survive as well." The following morning, Mateo headed into the settlement's general store and acquired precisely what the job required: timber for the framing, heavy planks for the loft decking, nails, pitch for waterproofing, and a compact cast-iron stove that ran him a mere $3. Grand total, he shelled out exactly $23.50. Charles Dietrich, who happened to be at the mercantile purchasing hardware, watched the man haul out his meager supplies and just shook his head. "That fellow won't last a single season," the carpenter muttered to the shopkeeper. Weeks slipped by, and Mateo kicked off his building project. He dug out the foundation for a modest shack, measuring roughly 20 by 26 feet. He stacked log walls until they stood about 6.5 feet high. However, instead of framing a traditional roof, he laid down a thick deck made from pine boards, slathered it tight with pitch, and layered it with packed straw. That heavy deck was designed to serve as both the ceiling for his dwelling and the flooring for the livestock pen. Next, he erected the barn walls right on top of it, adding tiny vents to allow airflow and constructing a side incline so the beasts could walk up. William McAllister rode past on horseback one afternoon in June and halted his mount to inspect the handiwork. "Sandoval, what in the name of blazes are you attempting to do here?" he hollered down from the saddle. Mateo, standing shirtless and slick with perspiration, set his hammer down and wiped his brow. "I am putting up a shelter for my children, Mr. McAllister." "That ain't no shelter, man. That's pure madness. You plan to stable cattle directly over the spot where your little girls sleep. Think about the dung, the stench, the sheer weight of it all. That flimsy rig is going to cave in the second we get a heavy snowfall. And if it doesn't crush you, the foul air will definitely make you all deathly ill." Mateo held the man's gaze steadily. "Mr. McAllister, with all due respect, my granddad raised a half-dozen kids utilizing this exact setup. Livestock heat doesn't cost a penny. It never runs out, either. And provided I build this decking properly, nothing is going to collapse. My household will stay perfectly warm while your folks are burning through every last cord of your chopped wood." McAllister chuckled contemptuously. "Sandoval, I own a top-of-the-line Franklin stove that set me back $40. I've got over an acre's worth of timber bucked up and neatly stacked. Plus, I possess the cash to procure more if we somehow run dry. I hardly need a herd of cows to keep me thawed out like some kind of savage." He spurred his horse and galloped off, still laughing to himself. Martha Cunningham also happened by alongside her daughters and was thoroughly scandalized by the sight. "Mr. Sandoval, this is downright indecent. Dumb beasts are not meant to reside above human beings. It flies entirely in the face of the natural order that the Almighty put in place. You are turning the world completely upside down." Mateo, growing weary of defending himself, merely replied, "Ma'am, the Lord placed warmth inside the bodies of all his creatures. I am simply making use of that blessing." Martha hurriedly crossed herself and marched down the trail, muttering breathless prayers under her breath. Charles Dietrich took the bluntest approach of them all. "Mateo, speaking as a professional builder, I'm telling you, that framework is a death trap. The sheer tonnage of 6 heifers, combined with the fodder and the winter snowfall, is going to snap those floorboards and bring the whole mess crashing down on your girls' heads. You're endangering your own flesh and blood simply because you refuse to spend money on a proper dwelling." Mateo clamped his jaw shut tightly. "Charles, I've crunched the numbers on the weight load. Each one of these joists can safely hold around 265 pounds. I've laid down 12 separate beams. I've got plenty of safety margin built right in." Charles threw his hands up in surrender. "When that contraption caves in, don't you dare say I didn't try to warn you." Yet Mateo kept right on pushing. He labored from the crack of dawn until it grew too dark to even see the nailheads. His palms developed thick, hardened calluses over top of older calluses. The youngsters pitched in however they managed. Eleanor hoisted up the siding. Carmela stood pitch and oil together, while little Lucia hauled fresh water straight from the creek. During the evenings, once they were completely spent, Mateo would regale them with yarns about Grandpa Esteban, the old herdsman who battled the freezing cold utilizing pure cleverness instead of cold, hard cash. "The world always points and chuckles at the fellow who builds things differently," he would remind them. Nature, however, never laughs. Mother Nature rewards the man who takes the time to comprehend her rules. By the time late August rolled around, the structure was fully completed. Viewed from the exterior, it resembled some kind of architectural monstrosity. A squat log shanty featuring a wooden upper level that jutted out in a highly awkward fashion. Nobody in the entire basin had ever laid eyes on anything remotely like it. The local youngsters dubbed it the Madman's Fort. The grown-ups referenced it as a prime example of exactly what a homesteader shouldn't do. Inside, though, Mateo's cabin was exceptionally sturdy, bone-dry, and patiently waiting to be put to the test. If you happen to believe that the wisdom of the old-timers holds more value than the arrogance of the modern age, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. We are out here salvaging the forgotten tales that the passage of time actively tried to erase. The dwelling that Mateo Sandoval had pieced together wasn't born out of insanity, but rather from a profound grasp of basic truths that mankind had long abandoned in its rush to build exactly like the neighbors. To figure out why his blueprint was destined to hold up right when standard homes were bound to fail, we need to dig into the specifics of his modest yet utterly brilliant engineering. The decking separating the livestock loft from the living quarters below was constructed using 5 distinct layers. The initial tier, the one facing directly up into the barn, consisted of pine planks measuring 2 inches thick, laid down tight without a single gap between them. Mateo had deliberately purchased green, unseasoned lumber at half the normal cost because the expert builders refused to touch it. Yet he fully understood that as the wood cured and shrank, those boards would lock together seamlessly. The second stratum was formulated from thick black pitch cut with linseed oil, spread out heavily in 2 generous coats. This barrier provided waterproofing and essentially caulked any remaining crevices. Layer number 3 was packed straw, measuring a solid foot deep, which served as a heavy thermal insulator. The fourth coating was a mixture of damp clay folded with dried dung and horsehair, a primitive technique utilized by the native tribes for centuries that cured into a barrier as impenetrable as solid rock. The fifth and final layer, facing straight down into the actual cabin, consisted of thin cottonwood slats that provided a neat, tidy finish for the interior ceiling. This combined floor and ceiling rig served a pair of extremely critical purposes. First and foremost, it had to shoulder the massive burden of the herd, their winter feed, and the inevitable snowpack without sagging an inch. Mateo had worked out the math, concluding that every individual pine joist could bear around 285 pounds before showing any signs of stress. He had laid 14 beams in total, spacing them approximately 16 inches apart. That math provided him with a safety buffer of well over 3,300 pounds, more than adequate for 8 fully grown cows, a half-ton of dry fodder, and the heaviest blizzards the Wyoming sky could possibly hurl at him. Secondly, and vastly more important, that decking needed to let the warmth drift downward while strictly preventing the foul odors and liquid waste from leaking through. The clay barrier and the heavy tar achieved exactly that goal. The radiating warmth would slowly bleed through the dense mass, but the fluids and noxious fumes remained permanently trapped upstairs. Up top, the animal loft stood about 10 feet high, dead in the center, allowing Mateo just enough clearance to stand totally upright while tending to the herd. The exterior walls were framed with vertical siding, featuring gaps just under an inch wide between each slat to guarantee proper cross-ventilation. That airflow was absolutely vital. Had the pen been boxed in airtight, the dampness from the cattle's breathing and their urine would have produced a heavy condensation that would eventually drip downward. Thanks to the steady draft, however, fresh breezes swept inside, soaked up the dampness, and exited straight through the upper vents. As a result, the loft stayed completely dry. The animals remained perfectly comfortable, and the thermal energy sank right to the bottom where they desperately needed it. Down below, the actual living quarters were cramped but highly efficient. It was a single open room spanning about 20 by 26 feet, guarded by solid log framing nearly 8 inches thick. Tucked into one corner, Mateo had nailed together a trio of elevated bunks for the girls, stacked one right over the other like ship's berths. Over in the opposite corner sat his own sleeping cot. Placed dead in the middle of the room was a small pine dining table paired with 4 wooden chairs he had whittled by hand, and pushed up against the northern wall sat that tiny cast-iron stove, a rig they would rarely ever need to fire up to its maximum limits. The underlying physics behind Mateo's setup were incredibly basic, yet amazingly powerful. A full-grown cow at rest gives off roughly 1,400 BTUs every single hour. To put that into plain English, it's essentially the same as keeping a medium-sized heater burning around the clock. Half a dozen cattle churned out the equivalent firepower of 6 steady stoves. That radiant heat initially drifted upward, warming the loft to somewhere between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit, even during the most bitter cold snaps. But the science experiment didn't end right there. That massive, heavy deck, sitting between the loft and the ground floor, functioned exactly like a thermal sink. It soaked up all that warmth for hours on end, then sluggishly radiated it back down into the room below. It was basically like installing a gigantic ceiling radiator that never ever sputtered out and required absolutely zero chopped wood to run. Mateo had picked up this little trick from Grandpa Esteban, naturally, but he had spent plenty of time polishing the concept through sharp observation. Throughout the early weeks of September, long before the real freezes set in, he climbed up into the loft every single evening, carrying a cheap thermometer he'd bought for 50 cents. He would gauge the mercury reading upstairs, then climb back down the ladder and check the exact temperature inside the cabin. On an average September night, when the outside air sat right around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the pen holding those 6 beasts would register at roughly 61 degrees. And down in the living quarters, without a single ember burning in the stove, the mercury hit roughly 64 degrees. The warmth was indeed sinking. The crazy contraption actually worked. Yet the labor didn't merely cease once the building stood complete. Mateo fully grasped that for his setup to operate safely through the bitter season, he required 3 key elements: robust livestock, ample forage, and unwavering discipline. All throughout the summer months and deep into autumn, he toiled without a moment's pause. He scythed the valley's tall prairie grass and hoisted it up into the loft. Every individual heifer demanded about 13 pounds of dry hay daily just to stay hearty, and produce a steady core temperature. Half a dozen cattle multiplied by 180 days of wintertime. That tallied up to roughly 14,000 pounds of feed. Mateo cut, cured, and stowed away over 15,000 pounds, a good 25% surplus, knowing full well he couldn't afford the luxury of running short. He likewise rigged up a reliable method for managing the manure. Every third dawn, he climbed up into the pen, carrying a scoop and a pail to muck out the accumulated droppings, which he then pitched into a dugout pit about 50 yards clear of the homestead. This chore kept the loft tidy, cut down on the stench, and prevented the buildup from spawning any dampness issues. It was backbreaking, filthy labor, yet Mateo tackled it without uttering a single complaint. His girls occasionally pitched in to help, though he constantly tried to shield them from the foulest chores. "You girls focus on your studies," he would instruct them. "Practice your reading. I will handle the herd." While Mateo ground through his endless loop of chopping hay, feeding cattle, and maintaining his oddball structure, his neighbors arranged their own seasonal preparations. William McAllister hired a crew of 6 laborers to fell and stack his cordwood. He shelled out $50 for a veritable mountain of cut pine and fir logs that towered like a fortress wall beside his residence. "This is exactly how prudent men handle their business," he bragged to his wife with swelling pride. "It matters not how bitter the frost gets. We shall remain perfectly warm." His dwelling housed a pair of cast-iron Franklin stoves, each one powerful enough to bake a spacious parlor. They were gorgeous, highly efficient, and incredibly costly appliances. They represented the gold standard of the American West. Charles Dietrich, the master German carpenter, placed his faith in his own superior craftsmanship. His dwelling boasted double-layered walls packed tight with sawdust to serve as insulation. It featured small window frames protected by heavy, solid shutters. It possessed a massive stone hearth placed dead center in the house that threw radiant warmth in every possible direction. "German engineering simply never falters," he boasted to anyone willing to lend an ear. "My homestead could weather the bitter winters of Bavaria. Wyoming ain't nothing compared to that." Martha Cunningham possessed her unwavering faith. "The good Lord will provide," she would preach. "We've made it through 4 freezes in this valley. We shall survive another." Her cabin was fairly standard, equipped with a single fireplace and a typical cast-iron cook stove. She possessed far less cordwood than McAllister, yet she trusted that her husband and older boys could simply chop more should the need arise. Furthermore, the settlement folks always looked out for one another. Nobody ever let their neighbors freeze to death. That was the unwritten law of the frontier. Come October, when the initial hard frosts painted the prairie grass a crisp white, the 3 neighbors rode past Mateo's acreage and witnessed a scene that seemingly validated all their worst suspicions. Mateo was perched up on the barn's roof, hammering extra slats to brace the corners. His daughters were down below scrubbing laundry in the creek, their knuckles raw and red from the icy water. The entire contraption looked terribly flimsy, hastily patched together, and utterly desperate. "Poor devil," McAllister muttered to his bride as they rolled past in their brand-new buckboard. "He's going to lose those girls this winter, and it'll be his own stubborn fault." His wife, Sarah, felt a sharp pang of sorrow. "We ought to offer him refuge when the deep freeze hits," she suggested. McAllister slowly shook his head. "I already offered him my counsel. I offered him a wage. He refused. A fellow who rejects a helping hand don't deserve no pity." Charles Dietrich took a much more pragmatic stance. "If his roof caves in come December, we can take the little ladies into our home," he told his wife. "But he's going to have to sleep out in Johnson's barn. I ain't got the floor space for 4 extra mouths." It was a highly calculated form of charity, the specific breed of kindness that arrives carrying heavy conditions. Martha Cunningham prayed for them every single evening. "Lord, shield that foolish man and his innocent children. Open up his heart so he might recognize his blunder before it's too late. She genuinely believed she was performing a righteous deed. She assumed Mateo was committing the grave sin of absolute pride by waving off all the proven pioneer methods. Yet Mateo wasn't committing any sins born of pride. He was committing an act of faith in a knowledge far older than any Franklin stove, far more tested than those heavy stone hearths, and far more dependable than the conditional charity of his neighbors. Every night, once his girls had drifted off to sleep, Mateo climbed the ladder into the loft and rested his palm flat against the flanks of his cattle. He felt that ceaseless heat, the steady rhythmic pulse of life itself, and he knew in his bones he had made the proper choice. The initial warning sign blew in on November 18th, 1886. Mateo woke up before dawn, just like he always did, and immediately sensed something terribly wrong in the atmosphere. A dead, suffocating silence. Not a hint of a breeze, no chirping birds, not even the distant babbling of the creek. He rolled out of his cot and pushed the cabin door open. The sky hung like a sheet of solid lead, an unbroken gray stretching from horizon to horizon, lacking even the thinnest fracture of blue. The air sat perfectly stagnant, yet felt razor-sharp, as though invisible blades were hovering in the dark, just waiting for the signal to strike. Mateo pulled the door shut in a hurry and roused his children. "Nobody steps outside today," he ordered them firmly. "Something fierce is rolling in." Eleanor, who at 15 years of age had already mastered the art of reading her father's expressions, didn't bother arguing. She helped her younger sisters slip into their thickest woolen garments and stirred up a pot of hot oats on the tiny stove. Outdoors, the daylight crept in, completely drained of color, almost as if the sun itself couldn't be bothered to make a proper appearance. Right at 10 in the morning, the snow started flying. These weren't gentle flakes drifting lazily on the breeze. They were jagged, frozen crystals, flying almost horizontally, propelled by a gale that had materialized out of nowhere, howling with the pent-up fury of a beast that had been chained up all year long. Within 2 hours, the entire landscape was swallowed whole. Mateo couldn't spot the creek located a good 50 yards away. He couldn't even make out the fence line he had strung up barely 60 feet from the door. He couldn't so much as see his own bare hands when he held them out in front of his face. Tucked safely inside the cabin, the girls huddled up close to the iron stove. Mateo strolled into the middle of the room and stared straight up at the cottonwood ceiling slats. He placed his palm flat against the timber. It felt warm, not scorching hot, but undoubtedly warmer than the thick log walls surrounding them. Straight overhead, resting comfortably on their bedding of hay, his 6 heifers were chewing their cud in total peace, churning out their 1,400 thermal units apiece, blissfully unaware that they were actively rescuing the very folks who fed them. The blizzard raged for 36 straight hours. When the howling finally died down, the valley was buried beneath 3 solid feet of snowfall. The mercury had plummeted to 18 degrees below zero. Mateo pushed his way out the front door, having to throw his entire body weight against the drifted snow to force it open, and the sight before him stole the breath right from his lungs. His fence posts barely peaked a foot above the drifts. The creek had frozen into solid glass, and way off in the distance, he could spot thick, greasy plumes of black smoke churning out of his neighbor's chimneys. Desperate, billowing clouds proving they were burning through their cordwood as fast as humanly possible to avoid freezing to death. Mateo stepped back inside his shanty, latched the heavy door, and checked the thermometer tacked onto the wall. 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside his humble home, without having stoked the little iron stove for more than 2 hours just to cook meals, the temperature hovered at a comfortable 63 degrees. Outside, it sat at 18 below zero, a staggering difference of 81 degrees. And that massive gap was being entirely provided by a half-dozen cattle munching on dry grass 1 floor up. Over at William McAllister's homestead, the scenario was turning incredibly grim. His $40 Franklin stove was roaring like a caged dragon, chewing through timber so rapidly that his two oldest boys had to haul fresh wood indoors every single hour. Yet, every time they cracked the door to step outside, an Arctic blast rushed in and immediately stole whatever warmth the iron beast had managed to build up. Those fancy glass window panes, so beautiful during the summer months, had transformed into solid sheets of ice, radiating pure cold directly into the parlor. Sarah McAllister had draped heavy quilts over every single frame, but it hardly made a dent. The children were sleeping wrapped in 3 layers of clothing. William slumbered clutching his wife tightly beneath 4 heavy wool blankets. Even so, come daybreak, they found thick white frost coating their interior walls. "This ain't natural," William whispered to his wife on the 3rd evening. "In 4 years out here, I ain't never felt a chill quite like this." Sarah, sporting badly cracked lips and knuckles covered in painful chilblains, merely nodded her head. She lacked the raw energy to even speak. They were burning 20 massive logs a day. That giant stockpile of timber William had proudly paid $50 to assemble was vanishing like dry sand sifting through a man's fingers. Should the freeze hold its grip, they simply wouldn't survive to see February. Down at Charles Dietrich's place, the famed German engineering was facing its ultimate trial, and it was failing miserably. The double-framed walls packed with sawdust performed decently enough when the weather hovered right around the freezing mark. But down at 18 below zero, that sawdust completely froze over, turned rock solid, and lost all its ability to trap dead air. The walls essentially transformed into giant blocks of solid timber and ice. The massive stone hearth situated dead center in the parlor, the feature he had bragged about endlessly, harbored a lethal design flaw. The heavy masonry absorbed the fire's heat, but it also drafted it straight upward, sucking it right out the chimney flue. Charles figured out the grim math. For every 3 logs he tossed onto the grate, only 1 actually warmed his family. The other 2 were busy heating the Wyoming sky. His wife, Greta, attempted to bake a loaf of bread on the cook stove, but the dough stubbornly refused to rise because the ambient air in the room was simply too cold. Their 3 young boys had developed a harsh, rattling cough that refused to break. Charles knew deep down it was the early stages of pneumonia. He knew that if the mercury didn't climb soon, he was going to end up burying one of his sons. During the dark hours, while the rest of the house slept, Charles would stare up at his own ceiling joists and think about Mateo Sandoval's idiotic backward structure. "Cows on the roof," he mumbled to himself. Impossible that it actually works. Yet a tiny fraction of his mind, a fraction he refused to acknowledge out loud, couldn't help but wonder. Martha Cunningham was combating the bitter winter with pure denial and ceaseless prayer. Every single morning, she gathered her brood around the table and recited psalms concerning the Almighty's divine protection. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," they chanted together, while their teeth actively chattered in their skulls. But the Lord wasn't miraculously stacking fresh wood on her pile, nor was he caulking the drafty cracks in her walls. Her husband, Thomas, had developed a grinding, heavy ache deep in his chest that grew worse with every passing day. Martha understood it was his heart. The brutal cold forced a man's heart to work double time just to keep the blood warm. Thomas was pushing 58 and had labored intensely his entire life. His heart was simply giving out. One bitter afternoon in early December, Martha finally made her choice. She wrapped herself tightly in her heaviest woolen cloak, muffled her face behind a thick scarf, and trudged straight through the snowdrifts toward Mateo's plot. She didn't tell a soul where she was headed. She couldn't bear for her family to watch her choke down her own immense pride. She hiked for 20 brutal minutes, fighting a headwind that constantly tried to shove her backward, until she finally spotted the Mexican's bizarre structure. A very thin wisp of smoke was curling out of the stovepipe, nothing like the thick, desperate clouds billowing from every other cabin. Warm yellow light spilled from the tiny window. There was actual life inside. Martha hammered her fist against the door. Mateo pulled it open, his face registering total, genuine shock. "Mrs. Cunningham, are you all right? Do you require assistance?" Martha pushed her way inside without waiting for an invitation, utterly desperate to escape the biting wind. And the moment she crossed that threshold, her body experienced something her frozen brain couldn't quite process. Heat. True, steady, deeply enveloping heat. Not the savage, blistering scorch of an overstuffed iron stove, but a gentle, radiant warmth pressing in from every single direction. Her frostbitten cheeks began to burn fiercely as the temperature shifted. "How?" she rasped softly. Mateo offered a sorrowful smile. "The herd, Mrs. Cunningham. I told you before, livestock heat never runs dry." Martha gazed upward, staring at the polished ceiling slats. She could clearly hear the gentle shifting of the cattle right above her head, the dull thud of hooves against the heavy decking, the low, rumbling moo of a heifer calling out in the dark. And she could physically feel the thermal energy pressing downward, real and unwavering, almost as if the ceiling itself had morphed into a heavy woolen blanket. "I came over here to beg." Martha swallowed hard, the very words causing her physical pain. "I came to ask if you might be willing to sell, or perhaps lend me a piece of your method. My husband is taking ill. My children are freezing. Her voice fractured completely. "I was terribly wrong about you." Mateo gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, I ain't going to charge you a single penny, but I can't exactly transplant my herd into your parlor. This setup works precisely because it was framed from the ground up for this exact purpose. What I can offer you is some extra forage, just in case you need to feed your own livestock heavier, so they throw off more body heat. And I'd be happy to hike over and inspect your chimney flue to see if you're losing drafts through any cracks." Martha looked up at him, the tears freezing directly onto her eyelashes. "Every last one of us mocked you. We all branded you a madman." Mateo gave a slow, measured nod. "I know, but that don't mean I'm going to sit back and let you all perish." Martha hiked back home that very afternoon, hauling a heavy sack of feed slung over her shoulder, carrying a massive shard of humility buried deep in her chest. She never confessed to anyone that she had paid a visit to the crazy Mexican homesteader. However, her cabin felt just a fraction warmer that evening, because her 3 cows ate a heavy supper and gave off more body heat than they had in weeks. December marched on, and the bitter cold refused to break. In fact, it grew considerably worse. Nighttime temperatures nosedived to 31 degrees below zero. The free-range cattle caught out in the open pastures simply started dropping dead. The frailest beasts would just bed down in the snowdrifts and never rise again. The saddle horses developed bloody, cracking sores around their hooves from the relentless ice. The hounds howled through the night, crying out from the sheer, agonizing pain of the frost. Mother Nature was aggressively collecting her debts. Yet, inside Mateo Sandoval's cabin, daily routines carried on with an almost offensive level of normalcy. His girls practiced their arithmetic and read from their primers while sitting around the pine table. Mateo schooled them on local history, sharing yarns about their ancestors who had successfully weathered brutal droughts, flash floods, and winters just exactly like this one. They simmered thick bean stews and baked sweet cornbread. They sang the old melodies that Rosa, their late mother, used to hum around the house. And every single evening, right before turning in, Mateo climbed up into the loft, hauling a pail of fresh water to tend the 6 heifers that were actively keeping his household alive without even realizing it. The thermometer nailed to the cabin wall never once dipped below 60 degrees. Not a single time. And Mateo understood exactly why. He had run the numbers. 6 beasts throwing off 1,400 BTUs an hour apiece. That totaled up to 8,400 BTUs of raw energy every 60 minutes. His living quarters measured roughly 516 square feet. To maintain an interior temperature of 63 degrees when the outside air sat at 22 below zero, he only required about 7,000 BTUs an hour, factoring in the standard heat loss bleeding through the doorframe, the single window, and the timber walls. He had an extra 1,400 BTUs to spare. He had built himself a solid margin of error. He possessed a contraption that undeniably worked. On the 9th of January, 1887, the brass barometer hanging in William McAllister's parlor plummeted so violently, his oldest boy assumed the gauge had finally busted. It hadn't busted at all. It was merely signaling that something truly monstrous was charging down from the Northern Territories. That very evening, the sky turned a sickly, bruised shade of green, a color that the grisly old trappers instantly recognized as the exact shade of death. The wind died completely. The wildlife went utterly silent. It felt as though the entire territory was holding its breath in sheer terror. At 3 o'clock in the morning on January 10th, the white hell was unleashed. It wasn't merely a blizzard. It was an apocalyptic event that the history books would later refer to as the Great Blizzard of January 87, a catastrophic storm destined to slaughter over 200 souls across Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. The gales struck first, howling at over 60 miles an hour, ripping shingles off roofs, tossing heavy wagons upside down, and suffocating livestock right where they stood. Next came the whiteout, not drifting down from the clouds, but flying sideways like a barrage of icy bullets that sliced straight through heavy coats and bit deep into human flesh. And finally arrived the killing frost, a bottomless freeze that hit 44 below zero and just kept on dropping. Over at William McAllister's place, the disaster struck immediately. A freak gust of wind completely tore the hinges off the shed where they stored the cordwood. The driving snow flooded inside like a tidal wave and buried half his winter supply in seconds. The logs that remained exposed froze so solid it became practically impossible to split them with an axe. William desperately tried to stoke his Franklin stove, but the frozen timber stubbornly refused to catch fire. They smoked heavily, but offered zero flame. The temperature inside his house dropped well below freezing, hitting 23 degrees. His children started weeping, not out of sadness, but from pure agonizing physical pain. The frigid air literally scorched their lungs with every single breath. Sarah McAllister knew they were doomed to die. She could read it plain as day in her husband's eyes. She could feel it in her own fingers, which completely refused to bend when she tried to flex them. "We've got to head somewhere," she whispered to William. "We're going to freeze solid in here." William peered out through the thick ice coating the window pane. He couldn't see a single landmark. Just a wall of blinding white, just howling wind, just impending death. But his wife was right. Staying put meant dying a slow, miserable death. Venturing out meant dying fast, but at least it was taking action. Down at Charles Dietrich's residence, the heavy stone chimney that cost him $70 to frame finally gave out. The violent, dramatic clash in temperatures, searing heat raging on the inside, pushing against the apocalyptic freeze on the outside, caused the heavy masonry to expand and contract far faster than the mortar could possibly handle. A massive fissure ripped right down the northern face of the stonework, and thick, choking smoke began pouring directly into the parlor. Charles was forced to make a horrific choice between letting his family freeze to death or watching them suffocate on the soot. He chose the cold. He smothered the fire entirely. He bundled his 3 young boys in every single quilt, overcoat, and scrap of wool he could lay his hands on. He and Greta laid down on either side of the children, using their own bodies as human shields against the lethal chill that had now completely conquered their home. "We're going to the Mexican's place," Charles announced suddenly. Greta stared at him as if his brain had finally snapped. "The lunatic who shoved cattle onto his roof? That shack has got to be buried in rubble by now." Charles shook his head stubbornly. "If it had caved in, we would have heard the crash over the wind. And if it hasn't fallen, it means it's still standing tall. And if it's still standing in this hellscape, it means he was right all along, and the rest of us were dead wrong. Over at Martha Cunningham's cabin, Thomas had completely stopped moving. He lay flat on the mattress, his lips entirely blue, his breathing dangerously shallow, his eyes locked blindly on the ceiling beams. Martha knew the end had arrived. She had prayed relentlessly through the night. She had begged. She had tried bargaining with the Almighty. But the Lord remained silent. Or perhaps he was answering her, and she simply refused to listen to the reply. Her eldest girl, Rebecca, grabbed her tightly by the arm. "Mama, we need to fetch help. Papa requires heat. We need to go where there's actual heat." Martha knew exactly where her daughter meant. There remained only one single spot in the entire valley where the warmth was guaranteed. The home of the very man she had branded a heretic. Right at 5 in the morning on January 18th, 3 desperate households abandoned their freezing tombs and began the grueling march toward Mateo Sandoval's absurd piece of architecture. William McAllister hauled Sarah in his arms, since her legs had completely given out. His 4 children trailed close behind in a single-file line, tethered together by a heavy rope so they wouldn't wander off into the blinding whiteout. Charles Dietrich strapped his youngest boy to his back. Greta gripped the other 2 tightly by the hands, literally dragging them through the drifts whenever they stumbled. Martha Cunningham and her 2 girls hauled Thomas on a heavy quilt they had fashioned into a makeshift stretcher, slipping, wiping out, dragging themselves back up, absolutely refusing to surrender. None of the 3 groups had any idea the others were also out in the storm. They couldn't see past 6 feet in front of their faces. They merely pushed toward the general direction where they recalled the Mexican's plot sat. William tripped and dropped to his knees 3 separate times. Every single time he hit the snow, his mind urged him to just stay down. Every time he fell, he figured it would be so much more peaceful to just close his eyes and drift off. But Sarah whimpered softly against his chest, and he forced himself back up onto his feet. Charles lost all feeling in his toes barely 10 minutes into the trek. He knew frostbite had set in. He knew he'd likely lose a few digits to the surgeon's saw. He didn't care. His boys were still drawing breath. That was the only thing that mattered. Martha prayed loudly as she hauled the stretcher, but she wasn't reciting psalms of protection anymore. She was screaming confessions of her own sins. "Forgive me, Lord, for my wicked pride. Forgive me for passing judgment. Forgive me for calling a man far wiser than myself a lunatic." Her daughters sobbed continuously, but the tears froze solid against their cheeks before they could even drop. Thomas hadn't twitched on the makeshift stretcher for a while now. Martha had no earthly idea if he was even still alive. She simply didn't dare stop moving to check his pulse. And then, akin to a miracle manifesting in the heart of that white inferno, they spotted a glow. A gentle yellow radiance shining steadily through a tiny pane of glass. Mateo Sandoval's peculiar framework was still standing tall. It hadn't caved in, nor had it blown away in the gale. It sat right there, sturdy, utterly impossible, and offering absolute salvation. William reached the threshold first, hammering against the heavy timber with his frost-bitten fist. Charles turned up mere seconds later, collapsing straight to his knees, right on the front stoop. Martha brought up the rear, dragging Thomas along, using every last ounce of her fading strength. Mateo threw the door wide open, his features registering absolute shock. Standing right out there on his porch were 15 souls suffering from varying stages of severe frostbite. The very same folks who had openly mocked him, branded him a lunatic, and prophesied his inevitable doom. Yet here they stood on his doorstep, freezing to death. Mateo didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. "Get inside! Hurry, every last one of you!" He stepped aside as the trio of households practically stampeded into the cramped quarters. The sudden shift in temperature proved so violent that several folks actually screamed out in sheer agony. Plunging from 44 below zero straight into 64 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of seconds forces the blood to rush violently back into frozen limbs, creating an indescribable level of torment. Sarah McAllister shrieked as she clutched desperately at her own fingers. Charles's little boys wailed, letting out a sharp, unbroken wail of misery. However, this was the specific ache of life rushing back in, rather than the numbness of passing away. Mateo and his girls sprang into action with well-rehearsed efficiency. Elena brewed up some scalding tea over the iron stove, while Carmela fetched every single quilt they owned, and little Lucia drew buckets of lukewarm, not hot, water to safely thaw out the frozen hands and feet. Mateo quickly sized up the crowd to figure out who was faring the worst. Thomas Cunningham remained completely unresponsive, his heartbeat dangerously faint. He laid the older man down near the firebox, though careful not to place him too close. A sudden blast of intense heat could easily finish off a fellow suffering from such severe exposure. The Dietrich boys were hacking with a deep rattling wheeze that practically guaranteed they had contracted pneumonia. Sarah McAllister exhibited severe frostbite across 3 digits on her right hand, the flesh having turned as pale and hard as candle wax. For 3 solid hours, Mateo labored simultaneously as a frontier doctor, a nurse, and a savior. He spoon-fed the piping hot tea in tiny sips, gently massaged the ice-cold limbs to restore circulation, and kept a close watch on everyone's breathing. And gradually, ever so painstakingly, their battered bodies began to bounce back. A healthy flush returned to their cheeks, the violent shivering subsided, and the weeping finally quieted down. Right around high noon, Thomas Cunningham fluttered his eyes open and rasped, "Where exactly am I?" Martha broke down weeping, overwhelmed by pure relief. William McAllister sat flat on the floorboards of the shanty, staring up at that cottonwood ceiling, listening to the gentle rustling of the herd, shifting around directly overhead, and physically feeling that steady blanket of warmth pressing down from the loft. He had blown $50 on split timber, dropped another $40 on a fancy iron heater, erected the grandest homestead in the entire basin, and very nearly slaughtered his own kin simply out of sheer arrogance. The impoverished Mexican fellow, a widower raising 3 girls, the very same man who had invested a measly $23.50 into his ridiculous shelter, had just rescued every last one of them. "Mateo!" William choked out, his voice thick with gravel. "I am truly sorry. You had it right all along, and I was dead wrong." Mateo met his gaze, his eyes betraying deep exhaustion, but completely devoid of any bitterness. "Mr. McAllister, this ain't about who was right and who was wrong. It is purely about making it through the freeze. And right now, we are all drawing breath, which is the only thing that truly matters." Charles Dietrich, the master builder who had framed dwellings all across the territory, practically crawled over to where Mateo stood. "Teach me," he begged the man. "Show me exactly how you pieced this together. Once the thaw hits, I intend to rebuild my own place using your blueprint, so my folks can finally be safe." Mateo offered a firm nod. "I'll gladly show you the ropes, and I won't charge you a dime for it. This wisdom doesn't belong to me anyway. It belongs to my grandpa Esteban, to the high country shepherds down in Chihuahua, and to any man willing to listen to Mother Nature instead of trying to brawl with her." Martha Cunningham didn't utter a single syllable, but simply dropped to her knees right in front of Mateo and kissed his calloused hand. The most profound display of humility she could possibly muster. Mateo gently helped the woman back to her feet. "Mrs. Cunningham, there is no need for that. We are neighbors out here, and neighbors look after their own." Martha shook her head in shame. "We didn't act like neighbors toward you. We acted like self-righteous judges. We were downright cruel. Yet you saved our hides regardless. The blizzard raged on for 4 solid days. A grand total of 18 souls bunked down inside that tiny 20 by 26-foot shanty. They took turns catching shut-eye and pooled the provisions that Mateo had wisely stashed away. And every single day, every passing hour, every ticking minute, the cabin held steady at a comfortable 63 degrees Fahrenheit, while the entire world outside literally froze to death. Up in the loft, the cattle simply kept munching their fodder, chewing their cud, and churning out their 1,400 BTUs an hour, totally oblivious to the fact that they had morphed into the most effective survival mechanism in the entire state of Wyoming. When the gale finally broke on January 22nd, allowing the sun to peek through the clouds for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, those 18 survivors stepped out of Mateo's door to witness a fundamentally altered landscape. The snowpack drifted as high as the cabin rooftops. Lifeless livestock lay frozen solid in twisted, unnatural postures, and the heavy timber had literally blown apart as the sap inside their trunks froze and expanded. It was a barren wasteland of total devastation. And yet, they were still breathing. They were drawing breath thanks entirely to a widowed Mexican fellow who had placed more faith in his granddad's old-fashioned wisdom than in the scoffing opinions of his peers. Springtime rolled into Wyoming terribly late in 1887, as the heavy snowpack didn't even begin to thaw out until the middle of April. Once the melt finally arrived, it laid bare the sheer scale of the tragedy. Over 200 settlers had perished across the basin and its neighboring counties. Roughly 80% of the livestock had been wiped out, while entire households simply vanished, found frozen solid inside their homesteads weeks later, when the surviving locals could finally dig their way through the drifts. However, within that tight-knit settlement hugging the Laramie River, 18 folks had successfully weathered the freeze inside a shack that everyone else had branded pure madness. Word traveled fast, prompting reporters from the Cheyenne newspapers to ride up into the valley specifically to chronicle the tale of the Mexican homesteader and his miracle barn. Mateo, who felt mighty awkward under the spotlight, simply repeated his standard line. It wasn't no miracle, it was just basic physics. Heat naturally rises, beasts produce warmth, and if you frame your house to trap that energy, your family gets to live. William McAllister pulled an entirely unprecedented move by selling off his massive estate to raise a brand new, considerably smaller cabin featuring a livestock loft built directly overhead. He hired Mateo on as his chief consultant, handing the man a $10 gold piece for his expert advice, and wrapped up construction on the new McAllister place by August of 1887. The following winter, when the mercury took another dive down to 4 below zero, William burned through a mere third of the cordwood he had exhausted the previous season, keeping his kin wonderfully warm and secure. Charles Dietrich completely overhauled his own property, ditching the massive stone hearth and the vaunted German architecture that had very nearly murdered his boys. He scrutinized every last square inch of Mateo's framing, jotting down meticulous notes inside a leather-bound ledger. His rebuilt dwelling boasted an upper-level pen housing 4 dairy cows alongside 5 goats. Goats, as Charles quickly figured out, actually threw off even more body heat pound for pound than the larger cattle did. Consequently, his family didn't merely scrape by the next deep freeze, they genuinely thrived, with his sons shaking off their lingering pneumonia and growing up tough as nails. Martha Cunningham's clan likewise rebuilt their homestead, and though Thomas managed to survive the heart attack that nearly put him in the grave, the ordeal left him permanently weakened. He simply couldn't put in the hard labor anymore. But his eldest boy, hardened by their brush with death, stepped up to the plate and framed out a slightly tweaked version of Mateo's blueprint. Substituting sheep in place of heifers, the young man discovered that a dozen ewes churned out the exact same thermal energy as 6 cows, while taking up a fraction of the floor space and eating significantly less fodder. By the time 1890 rolled around, 3 years following the Great Blizzard, 15 out of the 20 cabins situated in the Laramie River Basin had implemented some variation of that overhead barn architecture. The fresh arrivals pouring into the territory adopted the methods straight out of the gate, while the veterans who had endured that deadly winter actively tore down and retrofitted their older properties. The technique quickly shed its reputation as some crazy Mexican gimmick and rapidly morphed into the absolute gold standard for smart construction across the bitter frontier. Mateo Sandoval never amassed a fortune. He never bothered patenting his blueprint, nor did he ever collect a single royalty check. However, he earned himself a prize far richer than gold coin. He secured genuine respect, a rock-solid community, and a permanent chapter in the valley's lore that no blizzard could ever scrub away. His girls grew up to be strong, well-educated women, with Eleanor taking up the chalk as a school mom who went on to educate 2 full generations of local youngsters in the frontier schoolhouse. Carmela eventually wed Charles Dietrich's boy, tying the 2 households together in a deep bond that endured for decades. Little Lucia ultimately found her calling as a midwife, safely delivering well over 100 newborns throughout her lifetime. Mateo lived to see the ripe old age of 82, passing away peacefully during the winter of 1924, right inside the very same shanty he had raised 4 decades prior. During his twilight hours, encircled by his daughters, his grandkids, and his great-grandchildren, he found himself staring up at those cottonwood slats, listening closely to the familiar shuffling of the herd bedded down in the loft overhead. "Your great-granddad Esteban had it right," he rasped to his grandchildren. "Mother Nature won't ever brawl with you, provided you don't throw punches at her first. She provides every single thing a man requires, assuming he simply knows how to listen." They laid him to rest out in the basin's modest graveyard beneath a plain headstone that read, Mateo Sandoval, 1842 to 1924. He built things differently. He saved lives. His memorial service drew the largest crowd the territory had ever witnessed, bringing in mourners who traveled all the way from Montana, Colorado, and Nebraska. Folks who had heard the legend and personally adopted his life-saving methods. William McAllister, now a weathered old man of 70, stepped up to deliver the eulogy. "This fellow taught us that true humility possesses far more strength than arrogance, that old-school wisdom beats out modern trends every time, and that a dirt-poor Mexican homesteader holding $23 to his name can be vastly wealthier than a cattle baron running 1,000 head, provided he carries the right knowledge." Mateo's dwelling held its ground for another half-century, and when it finally met the wrecking ball in 1974 to clear a path for a new highway, local historians meticulously documented every single detail of its framing. They discovered that the original pine beams remained rock-solid even after 89 punishing years, while that heavy thermal decking, sandwiched between the living quarters and the animal pen, sat perfectly intact. The ridiculous contraption that the entire town swore would crumple during its maiden winter had practically lasted an entire century. If you walk into the modest historical museum down in Laramie County, Wyoming today, you'll find an entire exhibit dedicated to Mateo Sandoval and the brilliant innovation that rescued so many souls during one of the deadliest freezes in the history of the American West. The display features faded tintypes of his shanty, drafted blueprints of his handiwork, and framed copies of the newspaper columns that preserved his legend. It also houses a bronze plaque reading, "When ancestral wisdom collides with desperate necessity, it breeds innovations that defy common sense, yet deeply honor the laws of nature." The tale of Mateo Sandoval serves as a stark reminder that true progress doesn't always sprout from the priciest technology or the most fashionable trends. Sometimes it simply stems from a grieving widower recalling his granddad's fireside yarns, from the quiet humility required to admit we don't hold all the answers, and from the raw courage needed to build things differently, even while the whole town brands you a madman. And it always, without fail, emerges from a willingness to listen closely to Mother Nature, instead of foolishly attempting to conquer her through brute force. The fundamental rule that Mateo harnessed, the reality that livestock body heat can successfully warm a human dwelling if trapped correctly, certainly wasn't a brand new concept. The nomadic herdsman roaming Mongolia had relied on it for a millennia, Scandinavian agrarians had sharpened the method over centuries, and the indigenous tribes of the Americas had grasped the concept since ancient times. Yet out in the American West, circa 1886, a place where cold hard cash and the latest industrial gadgets were viewed as the only legitimate answers, it took one incredibly humble man to remind the masses that the most effective solutions were already out there, patiently waiting to be rediscovered. Yarns like the saga of Mateo Sandoval constantly remind us that true humility and a keen eye hold far more value than a sack of gold. They prove that traditional know-how is far from primitive, but rather battle-tested across countless generations. They remind us that the wealthiest fellow on earth isn't the guy with the fattest bankroll, but the man possessing the sheer wisdom to safeguard his kin using whatever raw materials he's got on hand. Furthermore, they highlight that labeling a man a lunatic simply because he builds things differently is often just a loud confession of our very own ignorance. If this particular tale of poetic justice and frontier survival managed to touch your heart, if it reminded you that there's an entirely different way to go about life that honors ancestral wisdom and the ironclad rules of nature, be sure to leave us a like and share this with somebody who needs to hear that the world rewards those humble and observant far more than the arrogant and the blind. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because we're going to keep on salvaging these lost legends. Stories about everyday folks who achieved extraordinary feats, not because they were inherently special, but simply because they possessed enough humility to learn from the ones who walked the trail before them. The next time somebody tells you that you've lost your mind for attempting something outside the box, just think about Mateo Sandoval framing out his upper-level barn while all his neighbors actively mocked him. And never forget that 18 souls survived the bitter cold simply because one solitary man possessed the grit to tune out the ridicule and put his faith in the lessons his granddad taught him beside a campfire high up in the mountains of Chihuahua so very many years ago.